bed trailers with the, that 11,500 feet of foam-filled boom. So you can, MassDEP could contract a tractor or tractors to pick up one or more of those trailers, or simply transport one of the 23 boom storage units, those boxes that are on those low bed trailers, and immobilize them to a different location. But it is, equipment, it will require, once they're taken to a location, that 42-inch boom requires either a forklift or a crane, and larger vessels to deploy. And again, that 42-inch foam-filled boom is more offshore boom for, ocean or Buzzards Bay or Boston Harbor or something like that.
And none of our responders in our trailers are 12 and 18-inch. None of them are being trained to do that. They're not contractors. They're towns to plan and to protect what is in their town, or if we call them out, to do it for someone else. So there's, and even with the GRPs and the tactics, we try to keep the tactics that we test to 1,000 feet or less. We're not looking at the towns to be deploying 2,500 or 3,000 feet, which is in some of the tactics for the GRS. So a lot of those are for contractors that come from out of state. They look at the GRS, they see where to go, they see what to do. You may say, go do BB-15, which is Ram Island, and that kind of thing. So there's a coordination, and there's who uses what for what, but we're not training first responders to use, like Mike was saying, the 42-inch or even some of the larger quantities of a boom. It's for, contractors and moving forward with a bigger response.
And Julie, we also have the ability to use our oil spill contractors to use their resources to address a spill as well, don't we?
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
So in addition to the trailers, we have the opportunity to use our contractors to get additional resources as necessary.
Yep. Yes.
Elise, did you have a?
More of a comment than a question to add on to what Julie said. Maybe back to what Francis said, which is the purpose of the trailers and the GRSs is really to protect local sensitive areas at the end of the day. And so that's complementary to an opera coming in and deploying big equipment, trying to contain that sewers, trying to do the big on-water recovery. So it's really a complementary response tool and not necessarily meant to be the primary equipment.
Thank you.
Right.
So I just want to summarize that very quickly for the recordings, because it was excellent comments, and please correct me if I'm missing something. But I think the conversation that just took place was that these GRSs are an excellent program to be able to protect the local sensitive resources within the community, and that the responsible party has their own obligation to bring resources for the cleanup. The local folks would be able to protect those local resources with the use of the GRSs. Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank all of our speakers for really providing us some good information about the use of these prevention. A 5-minute break.
All right, if everybody could grab their seat, that would be great. We can get going. So we can get going. Do you want to start up? Let's do it. Okay. I was hoping to start the session by saying good morning, but I have to say good afternoon. And hopefully you'll stick with it because these are pretty interesting talks. My name's Gerard Martin. I'm the Deputy Regional Director for the Bureau of Water Resources in DEP's Lakeville office. Water resources includes wetlands, water supply, and wastewater. But at the time of the Bouchard spill 20 years ago, I was actually in the Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup. I was the section chief of the site management section, and that section oversaw the long-term cleanup of hazardous waste sites that take a fairly long time. But as you've heard today, given the magnitude of this release, a lot of other people were enlisted, myself included. I was enlisted, and I was part of the SCAT teams, the shoreline cleanup and assessment technique teams that went around to assess the oil spills and actually delivered some oiled injured birds and some dead birds to the wastewater treatment facility in New Bedford where they were trying to rehab the birds that were oiled. So I was out there on the front lines. Eventually, when Millie became the regional director, I became the deputy regional director for Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup, and shortly after that, I actually took over her role as the trustee representative for the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and I am still in that role now, even though I've switched to a different bureau. So I'm actually working on some of the projects that you're going to hear about today, and it's actually one of my favorite parts of my job is actually working on these projects because you're actually seeing a lot of good things done. And I think you'll understand why when you hear the presentations today. I mean, what could be better than dealing with translocating loons? It's a lot better than working on groundwater discharge permits for a wastewater treatment facility. So anyway, which is important. So today we're going to start off with Jim Turek. He's a restoration ecologist with NOAA, and he's going to give us kind of a high-level overview of the injury, the settlement, restoration categories, statistics, and a map showing where some of our NRD projects are throughout the area. So with that, okay, Jim.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for hanging in there. And
You have 1 minute. No.
1 minute. There we go. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for coming today. Thanks for hanging in. Yeah. So I was involved, not actually doing the assessments, but I was on the ground to see some of the injuries that resulted right away in 2003. And so that was a good thing because I normally do restoration work, but it was good to know the kind of habitats and resources, species in particular that were adversely affected by this spill. So I kind of transitioned from at least learning, about the injuries that occurred and then what we were going to try to bring back as part of the injury restoration. So with this first slide, the question that often arises: how do you get from an injury or a spill release, like the photo on the left-hand side, that's oiling of the sand beach over somewhere in Dartmouth, to actually like a shellfish project in Buttermilk Bay in the center photo, or a dam removal on the Weweantic River in Wareham? And so that's why I'm going to try to at least refresh everybody's memory or provide a little bit of information so you'll learn something today. But so we put together this simple slide that kind of lays out the process, the NERDAR process. How do you get there? So of course the first one is the injury assessment that Gerard worked on along with a lot of his colleagues and other folks, and getting to a point of a damage determination. the quantity of habitats of each type that were adversely affected by the oil coating, the loss or killing of animals or oiling of those animals. And so you get to that damage determination, and there's, of course, a currency that you use for each of those. It then takes you into restoration scaling and ultimately getting to a consent decree with the responsible party. And that's what we did with, there were two different consent decrees, of course, one being the first one in 2011, and that was primarily for the shoreline and aquatic injuries, the piping plover, Ram Island, and I think that was about it for the first one. The second one was loon, terns, and other birds, which occurred in 2018. But as part of that process, certainly there's a major public input component on projects, potential projects for restoration. And so in 2011, we held two different public meetings, one being down here in Bourne and the other one over in Fall River. And so, of course, we were trying to get folks to come out and kind of let us know their thoughts on what kind of restoration could or should be done. And so that is part of the process, which then led us into the preparation of the first restoration plan / EA. And so the draft came out in 2000 and I think it was early 14. And again, so that draft goes out, and it basically was taking a lot of ideas that were in that public input, and there were 70 ideas that were submitted. We went through a OM, Office of Management and budget form process. It's basically a standard form that allows the public to give some kind of understanding to the trustees, so we knew the kind of potential projects that could be available out there for doing restoration. And so that ultimately led to the restoration plan, environmental assessment under NEPA, and we ended up putting out what's called the programmatic restoration plan, EA, in September of 2014. And so that allowed us to then move forward with our projects. So that was all great stuff, and so you understand at least the process, but you weren't aware of it, because a lot of people aren't, but that's how we get there. So taking a step back now, back to the injury assessment and the injury categories. As I mentioned earlier, so we had certainly shoreline and aquatic oiling and cleaning injuries. We had the birds and wildlife that were killed or oiled, local coastal access, lost recreational boating, and lost recreational shellfishing, which was due to human health closures, some of which extended more than 6 months or more. And those, the photos on the right-hand side of the slide, just kind of show you the extent of the oiling that occurred along nearly the 100 miles of shoreline. And of course, in those cases, when we were trying to quantify those injuries, it was, as people talked about earlier today, the intensity of the oiling, whether it was heavy, moderate, light, or very light, and then the band, basically the width of the bands, and then of course the lengths of each of those shoreline segments. It got us ultimately to those numbers of injury. And so with restoration planning, so the goal, of course, is to get to the equivalent of what was adversely affected, by that spill or release, and includes, essentially an interim losses until you get a habitat or the resource back to its baseline condition. It's not going to necessarily be a perfect condition. It was the condition that occurred, prior to the spill event. So that's really what we focus on. And so that graphic you see there is just a hypothetical balance. What you're trying to do is meet equivalent of what was affected. So there's a number of different ways to do it, and we typically use what's called equivalency analysis, and it could be either for the habitats itself or a resource like a certain bird species, and that's how we get there to provide a proposed restoration project that ultimately results in what's called uplift to bring back a species or a habitat. And I'll just lastly say that the whole process takes into account discounting, because if you basically are trying to bring a resource back but it takes time to get there, you've got to include discounting as part of your project, because essentially you've got the cost of inflation to get there. So if you got to implement a restoration project, you got to think how much it's going to cost to get to it, and therefore we apply a discounting as part of that process. Okay. So, yeah, I just wanted to, just outline, this is how we completed our work. There's a lot of engagement, with various entities. Early on, we certainly had many conversations with the responsible parties consultants to talk about, they presented potential projects for restoration. We looked at others, and it was basically just trying to reach some kind of consensus on how we could reach a settlement based upon viable projects and then costing them out. And so that's how that occurred. And essentially, we also had people, from various organizations helping us with the input on some of these projects. Okay, and this, that's a summary of what we came out. We have over 50 projects we've completed throughout the Bay, and then some of the projects over in Rhode Island, since that was also affected. But just a gamut of projects, some of which we're going to talk about with others today here on the team. And that, of course, those relate specifically to shoreline, aquatic, and then the lost uses, whereas these projects that Latice is going to speak about relate back to the bird restoration. And so, as you can see, we've got loon restoration projects in almost all the New England states, plus the state of New York, and then with the piping plover projects that were all completed a while back, there was literally 19 different beaches that were affected, for restoration purposes. And my last slide is just to let you know of all the various organizations that were involved. All 9 towns along the Buzzards Bay shoreline that were involved, as well as a whole gamut of different organizations, state agencies, the Nature Conservancy, Biodiversity Research Institute, and of course the Buzzards Bay Coalition, along with Mass Audubon. So you can kind of see it's a lot of effort. It's certainly not the trustees working by ourselves. It takes a great effort by people to work on all the various phases of restoration to get there. So that's about all I have, and we're going to turn it on to Brendan, I think. Yep.
Thank you, Jim. Another benefit of working on NRD projects, it exposed me personally to a lot of areas in the area that I hadn't been to before, and Brendan's going to talk about one of them, Horseshoe Pond, Cuddy Hunk, Allen's Pond, and it's really amazing what we have out there for resources. So right now, Brendan Arnett is the Vice President of Watershed Protection at the Buzzards Bay Coalition, and he's going to talk about some of these projects, the shoreline and aquatic resource restoration projects, Horseshoe Mill Dam removal, conservation boat moorings, bird habitat protection on Cuddy Hunk, and the Nascatucket Bay restoration expansion project. Brendan?
Thank you, Gerard. I don't need to say anything about oil, actually. What you're looking at here are American eel, juvenile American eel, born in the mid-Atlantic and having traveled all the way to Buzzards Bay, then moving into all of our estuaries. These ones stopped at the former Horseshoe Mill Dam, an industrial dam site. We're going to hear a little bit about how that story plays out. So I want to talk just briefly about Buzzards Bay Coalition, because it's no longer Mark and 3 other people in that basement office. We've grown to 30 professional staff year-round, in the summertime pushing 50 with seasonals. We have a board of directors that's made up of 20 people from towns all around the Bay. We have a leadership council that advises us and serves as a bench to fill in future boards of directors. That's made up of 70 people. We have hundreds of volunteers involved in all sorts of activities, from water quality monitoring to conservation land management, assisting with restoration projects. We have more than 10,000 members now. My point being is that Buzzards Bay Coalition is people. It's the people around the Bay who enjoy the Bay, who use the Bay, who value the Bay, and Buzzards Bay Coalition has developed to focus their interest and efforts to restore and protect the Bay for the future. We do this through multiple program areas that Mark mentioned. The one that I manage is called Watershed Protection, which is land conservation and ecological restoration. I wanted to point out that shortly after the spill, sort of the timeline that Mark was talking about and the various involvement that the organization had in the response, there were penalty funds separate prior to the NRD that became available and were distributed through a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service program. And our land conservation program mobilized in a way where we wanted to access those to protect as much of unprotected land around the bay as possible. And we did that by coordinating groups of existing conservation organizations, local land trusts, town conservation commissions, and other town departments in the areas around the bay. And we're actually able to access about $6 million of those penalty funds to protect nearly 1,500 acres of land in the towns all around the bay. But through that, we sort of learned how to do big projects and how to leverage, not just how to use that money, but how to leverage that to turn it into, to leverage other money so that we could do bigger projects. And that ends up becoming important when it comes time that the NRD settlement is announced and there's funds available, we're ready with big projects. And Jim talked about them. I'll just work around the bay counterclockwise. At the head of the bay, very close to here, is the Weweantic River, the largest tributary of the bay. And we'll talk about a dam removal there. Nascatucket Bay, right behind West Island, which has been mentioned a number of times today. I'm going to talk about a project there. Cuttyhunk Island, just miles away from where the incident happened at the entrance to the bay. And then West Falmouth Harbor, on the Cape side shoreline of the bay with the Conservation Moorings Project, which I'll get right into. So conservation moorings, the idea here is that traditional moorings with their chain anchor rod attached to a mushroom anchor, I don't know if you can see it, but what the yellow lines point to are the scarring of the benthic habitat, the bottom sediment, the shellfish, and particularly eelgrass that occurs from this traditional mooring setup. And so actually, Mass Division of Marine Fisheries had experimented a bit with these conservation or eco moorings that are basically attached to a helical screw that goes directly into the harbor bottom and then has a flexible rod that attaches to the mooring pendant. And they proved that, or they demonstrated that there was some potential here. So West Falmouth Harbor, which is loaded with moorings. We asked for about $100,000. We asked for $100,000. We're awarded that. We were able to leverage more than $100,000 additional, actually some additional grants that came in. And we're able to replace 52 traditional moorings in the bay. We do this primarily at the entrance to the bay where the water quality is still such that it can support eelgrass. And this basically sort of is helping to transition that harbor towards this less impactful way of managing moored boats in the harbor. So more than 25% of the moored boats now on conservation moorings. A big project over behind West Island. So I said the west side shoreline, midway, this is Fairhaven and Mattapoisett, is the Nascatucket Bay Land Conservation Project. This was one of our early proposals to the NRD Trustee Council. It awarded almost $1 million, $960,000 towards a more than $6 million project. It was a 411-acre waterfront property to be conserved. So this is sort of seems remarkable in southeastern Massachusetts that there's still these large properties on the waterfront, but they won't be there forever. So that's sort of the importance of work like this to get these things done. It was immediately adjacent to the Nascatucket Bay State Reservation, and this project doubled the size of that state park, added waterfront land, including beach, some salt marsh, tidal channels, a stream that actually supports American eel, interesting public access, not only to the water, but it connects to a regional bike trail that goes from Mattapoisett Harbor over to New Bedford Harbor, so a lot of connections to the public for access, and tremendous benefits for coastal water quality protection and protecting habitat for birds, fish, and all sorts of shellfish coastal resources. So here's a picture of part of that property. I think one of the important things here is that Nascatucket Bay is actually probably one of the richest ecological embayments with the richest ecological resources outside of the Elizabeth Islands within the bay. For a number of reasons, it's that way now. And because of this land protection and actually a lot of that previous penalty-related funded land protection, we were able to focus around the bay. We have a good chance of keeping it that way because a large portion of both the shoreline, if I can go back, you can see a lot of the protected land in green in addition to the blue that we've been successful with to permanently protect this embayment in the middle of the western coast of Buzzards Bay. Moving forward, another large land conservation project was on Cuttyhunk Island that Gerard mentioned. So the trustee council awarded almost $1.2 million towards this project. This was a $7 million land conservation project with multiple sellers, multiple landowners that protected actually 300 acres of land on the island. A picture here looking from above the main hill on the island, sort of looking up the Elizabeth Island chain. That's Penakees on the left and Noshawina out in front with the Cuttyhunk Harbor below. But again, significant coastal shoreline protection, important public access protection, a lot of other natural resource benefits to the community out there as well. But a number of important bird species, nesting shorebirds, terns, and plover, also nesting sea ducks. And we continue to actually monitor the sea duck nesting out there. We're going to be doing it with some of you next week, actually. But again, habitat protection and coastal water quality protection, really important here. Another project, this is looking west, actually, the spill incident, sort of off to the right from that picture. This is from the top of Cuttyhunk Island looking west-southwest. All right, Horseshoe Mill Dam, I mentioned this at the very beginning, that this is where those juvenile eels were found. So this is a 250-year-old blockage in the main, or the largest tributary river of Buzzards Bay. There was a factory here that actually processed metals, produced horseshoes a long time ago. For a long time, it had just been abandoned, but this hulking piece of infrastructure was still left in the river, blocking fish. There was one of the turbine races from the factory actually had some broken concrete in it, and at certain flows could pass fish. So in fact, this river was still supporting remnant populations of river herring, both species of river herring, white perch, tomcod, hog choker, lamprey, American eel, importantly, white perch, and some sea-run brook trout. So not just a single species, but sort of a remnant assemblage of sort of the intact diversity of fish populations that historically relied on Buzzards Bay estuaries. The other thing about this dam was it wasn't up the river, it was literally at the head of tide. So on big tides, the tide would actually get backed up at the dam and sometime would press through some orifices in the dam and push marine organisms into the impoundment, where you'd have menhaden and blue crab and shrimp stuck in there, and then the tide turned and all these birds and big largemouth bass would just be feasting on the stranded marine organisms. Not only that, because it's at that location, it's prohibiting the migration or movement of important coastal habitats up that river corridor and estuary corridor. So something that, as we lose salt marsh to climate change and sea level rise, it's important to sort of consider dams or obstructions at this location where it prevents that natural movement of that habitat, so that we still have some of it in the future. In addition to that, we were able to do this project in a way where we created not only trail access on the property that we acquired, which is popular to the community, but also install some coastal access with 2 kayak and canoe launches at that site. So lastly, a picture of that site. I think the important thing here is, like, after 250 years of fish getting stopped at the dam, which was located right here, Weeantic actually in Wampanoag language means the very winding river. You can see the bay on the left. We're pretty much looking south right here, and you can see how it winds around with the estuary on the left and the freshwater stream coming in on the right. But today, those eels, right now, as we speak, those little juvenile eels are actually moving upstream into the river. And then when they actually move back out into the estuary and the bay, just a tremendously important part of the food web as a forage food base for the rest of fish. So if I was going to reflect on these projects, the one thing that I think sort of that I would pass on to you is that it's important to think big. The incident was big. The threats to natural resources on the bay and our environment in general are big. When we're thinking about natural resource protection and restoration, we should be thinking about doing big projects. The natural resource, the NRD Trustee Council contributed about $2.2 million to those 2 land conservation projects. We were able to leverage more than $11 million additional to complete those. And I think we're very proud of that, but I think that's a model of sort of what we should be motivating folks to think about is when we're talking about protecting and restoring natural resources, we should be looking to do big things. And together, I think we can do that.
Thank you, Brendan. Over the last couple of years, when I have a bad day at work, which is in Lakeville, I'll take off and go down to Assawamsa Pond and hike around a little bit. And over those last couple of years, I've seen several loons that have come back to Assawamsa Pond, and it's such a good feeling to see them. And then recently, I was over at Copacut Reservoir and saw a loon there, maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago. Copacut Reservoir is right on the Dartmouth Fall River line. Because of the NRD projects, there's loons in Fall River, which is pretty exciting. And to get into that a little bit more, we're going to have Latice Fuentes, who is a wildlife and fisheries biologist at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And she's going to talk about common loons and other birds, piping plovers, and terns. Latice?
This microphone is intense, isn't it? Oh, let's see. Ooh. Okay. So, thank you again for the introduction. I, too, have to refer to the historical documents because I was not around at the time of the spill, nor was I around during the time of some of this restoration, like writing of the restoration projects. So I'm going to read off my script a good bit here just for the sake of not missing anything because so much work has been done and it's really important to point all of that out. And again, I'm here to talk about the status of the bird restoration. And I'm doing that on behalf of the B120 Trustee